you elaborate how the world is changing, both demographically and economically?
We're living through the biggest shift in global financial and demographic power since the 1500s. We've had 500 years of Western predominance. That's really the big story of modern history, and it's coming to an end now, and it's coming to an end very rapidly indeed. Partly because of the speed with which China and other non-Western economies are industrializing, and also because of fundamental differentials in birth rates. So the world of the 21st century is going to be a world in which the West, as conventionally defined, will play a much smaller economic role and will be demographically even more of a minority than in the past, maybe 10% of the world's population by 2050.
Since your book was published in 2007, was it? 2008?
2008 was the ascent of money, yeah.
But you've been writing it for years, and you timed the financial crisis quite well. And what has changed since summer 2007 in terms of have people learned a lesson?
Well, as is always the case in these crises, people learn lessons, but often the wrong ones. And I think one of the curious things about the debate since the crisis has been how badly focused it's been. The key causes of the crisis, which is really the central argument of the ascent of money, were excessive leverage on bank balance sheets, errors of monetary policy, contamination of the bond market by misrated assets, and the politicization of the real estate market. I mean, these really were the key things. And you will look in vain for solutions to those problems in most of the regulation that has been introduced since then. More than 1,000 pages of legislation in the United States. Very little of it addresses the key issues. One obvious example being that the role of the rating agencies remains completely unreformed. So I do feel as if the crisis has not been sufficiently well understood that we're doing the right things to avoid a repeat. The banks have got less leveraged, but there are fewer banks, so there's more financial concentration than there was before in the United States. We have a long way to go, I think, before we can really say that we've learned the right lessons from this crisis.
Did capitalism fail?
Well, capitalism has a tendency to suffer crises. That's one of the things about which I agree with Marxists. The question is whether the crisis is what Joseph Schumpeter called creative, in the sense of creative destruction. And in some ways it has been. There was a great clear out of less well-managed hedge funds, for example. In other ways it hasn't been creative. Interventions to bail out insolvent banks on both sides of the Atlantic have created a very dangerous overlap between government and private sector finance. The too big to fail institutions are really a very unhealthy phenomenon. So maybe the answer is that capitalism didn't fail enough, in the sense that there weren't enough really creative bits of destruction. And that, I think, is why the situation in the West is still quite unhealthy, why the problems of banking in Europe have not really been addressed yet.
Just one last question. You talked about Keynesianism many times. Did it work? It's the first time it's been tried.
Well, it worked in the sense that running large deficits was preferable to trying to balance budgets in the teeth of the crisis, and I always argued that in the short run it was the right thing to do. The problem is that in the United States the plan is to run deficits every year for the rest of time, as far as the eye can see, and that isn't Keynesianism, and it's not something that Keynes would have approved of. So short run, I think Keynesianism worked. So did monetarism, because that was really what the Fed did. The question is whether the two strategies can be exited from in a way that doesn't simply cause the crisis to resume. And that turns out to be much trickier. It's easy to run a deficit in a crisis. It's much harder to try to balance the budget when the crisis is over.
Or repaying debt then.
Well, I mean, the debt repayment dream of the late 1990s has completely vanished. Right now, the issue is not repayment. It's whether you can stop the debt from growing. And in order to just stop the debt from growing, the United States has to do things that are almost politically inconceivable. A 12.5% increase in taxes or reduction in benefits. Just try selling that to American voters.
Well, pulling out of any conflict. They're in a substantial amount of countries now.
It's inevitable that the US military will have to downsize. That process has already begun, and it means that it's clear that over the next few years there will be a reduction of the American presence in Afghanistan, in Iraq and elsewhere, you might regard that as a good thing if you're hostile to American power. My own view of that is be careful what you wish for, because the world without the United States in the greater Middle East may be a great deal less stable than the world with the United States as the global hegemon.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.